Okay, I know that this is meant to be overdramatic, but honestly, that's what I would have been like if Keyframe broke up with me. Having a miscommunication or misunderstanding formula in an episode is a rather unfortunate circumstance as it drags out a story in Friendship is Magic. You have Pinkie Pie and Swarm of the Century collecting musical instruments that hinder the efforts of others when attempting to get rid of the parasprites, only to conclude that Pinkie's instruments were the answer. You have the Wonderbolts in Newbie Dash neglecting to mention their intended traditions of name-calling until at the very end, because Dash sabotaged the team's performance. Now, having a miscommunication narrative isn't necessarily bad within itself, it's just that it's been very poorly executed over the course of the series. These two episodes suffer as primary examples because they were very sloppy in hindsight. Any form of simple communication from that point on would have hindered the length, and the journey of those two set episodes wouldn't exist and writers would have to concede and invest more effort. A better way to perpetuate a miscommunication formula is to take on any hindering option at first hand. That way the audience isn't sure on what the next option would be, thereby allowing themselves to be in the shoes of the main protagonist, wondering what could happen next. In the case of the Break-A-Breakdown, having a miscommunication narrative has done a lot in the episode's favor compared to the previous set episodes, and it tackles on the importance of communication as each side comes to a flaw to learn from. It helps push Big Mac's development, overcoming the biggest fears and insecurities that play a huge role for Sugar Belle and further establishing both of these characters who are at their lowest point. This is on top of adding two separate subplots that play up their misunderstanding more hysterically, albeit one of the subplots didn't contribute as much and the other has a difficult ball to roll with. But I'll put a pin on those two for now since they're not the central focus. As the name suggests, the episode tackles Big Mac's feelings on the possibility of losing Sugar Belle after eavesdropping on the conversation with her and Mrs. Cake. And by no surprise, he takes it extremely hard. At first glance, the audience would already predict that this is a misunderstanding whenever the episode reaches the end. However, because of how much Big Mac has to process what he heard, his fears of facing the issue is more of an obstacle than being upfront about it. The very thought of losing her and not being sure on how to deal with it afterwards plays a huge insecurity, and it's all a matter of time before he'll bite the bullet and realize what needs to be corrected. Thus, the journey becomes more focused, leaving the viewer allegedly anxious for Big Mac to face it in the best way possible. In addition, there's a brief moment with Sugar and Mrs. Cake that provides more thought.
Imagine the look on his face when I tell him, we need to talk.
Oh, dear me, no. I told you, don't say it that way, or he'll think you're breaking up with him.
Break up with him? Never. Why, without my favorite delivery pony, I couldn't imagine being happy ever again. He knows that.
Good. Save your mix-up for cake batter, that's what I always say.
On the surface, it's another play-up that's a misunderstanding, but what's provided here is where I address how each side has a flaw. As Big Mac doesn't know everything what Sugar Belle was talking about, her moment here provides a different side of miscommunication. Tone. Tone is something a lot of people understand, but more often than not, they underestimate it as it gives more sense of feeling. There could be a situation with the best intentions where I'd get somebody a box of chocolate with a pair of roses. I'd say happily I got them for that someone. But at other times I could be having a bad day and inadvertently say it with a deadpan or aggressive tone that would lead the moment into a sour impression. Tone resorts to what just isn't said, but how it's said. And honestly, I would have loved to have had this been played up more often in the episode, since this is only one scene. Instead, the way it's set up is that the script tries surprising the viewer with Sugar Belle's full information on her matter. I could see this as what the viewers would be left in the dark with, but the problem is that because of how predictable the ideal outcome would be, the idea of surprising this is fruitless, especially given its earlier moment. This doesn't necessarily hurt the episode, but I feel this would make the message about miscommunication more thorough and even out the conflict with these two. It also doesn't help on how selective the dialogue was at first when Big Mac was eavesdropping. It seemed too convenient to put Big Mac in this predicament in the first place, as what he heard felt solid on his own merits. Ironically enough, we had an earlier scene where Spike took a wildly accurate guess about Sugar Belle's cousin. But even though that's funny and bizarre in hindsight, I wouldn't go putting dumb luck as a plot convenience when the story is meant to rely on being productive and confrontational. It doesn't hurt the episode obviously, but it doesn't really even things out as we haven't seen much screen time for Sugar Belle's side. However, I do like that Spike tries really hard to calm Big Mac down, even when his choice of words are admittedly awkward.
Okay, things seem bad. Maybe they're really not. Maybe "we're finished" was about the day. Ponies say that, right? Like, hey, remember yesterday? That's finished, because it's today. Maybe not that.
Crowdfunding for GoldenFox Pictures is supported by these following patrons: ThomasFan3751, Signed Steel Rail, Azure Lore, Brandon Bishop, War Hero, Edwin Flores, Rainbow Dash Fan, Drog1989, Filmer Brony VA, The Bluish Pony, Alexander Ziffy, Iceberg, and YeelWolf01. Thank you all very much for your support. For any future projects you would like to know what I'm working on, support me on Patreon to anticipate any blog entries for sneak peeks, schedule releases, what's in the works, and what's even on my mind. Links down in the description. Now, in some retrospects, this may only work depending on how you feel for Big Mac as a character and his relationship with Sugar Belle after he won her in Hard to Say Anything. While that episode had its issues, something I failed to mention was the relationship with these two. Comparatively, this couple grew to becoming one of my favorite pairings over the course of the series. Going over the previous speculations of Big Mac's past interactions, it ideally started out with Miss Chairly and Hearts and Who's Day. Obviously, that was at the expense of the love poison, but there was a short moment in Philly Vanilli where she was serenaded by the a cappella performance. However, despite all of that, there wasn't much screen time with them. What's worse is that if they did get back together after the incident with the Crusaders, this would come off as a bad influential expense that contradicts Hearts and Who's Day's implied message, that being you should never force a relationship. The only potential that would have worked with this relationship was how vocal Chairly was. But outside of that, she's a teacher. That's it. Arguably there could be more about her, but there's just not enough common interest for Big Mac of any sort to convince me. Moving to other characters, Marble Pie had her moment with Big Mac as they paired together in an activity in Hearthbreakers. I touched upon this before and stated that it was a possible incest, only to be argued that it wasn't. I won't bother with that though, since that isn't my biggest gripe with this pairing. Neither of the two spoke up or did anything else other than give out their cues, Big Mac saying yup and Marble Pie nodding. They're so identical with their introversities that they wouldn't be challenged to confront anything different from each other, and thus there would be no development at all. Also, I really hate it when they don't have a word to say to the point where it's their only trait. Yes, actions speak louder than words, which is what some people see Big Mac as, but you still need to be communicative. That's just common sense. Speak! Fans have also made a long-time comparison with Fluttershy and Big Mac because of the familiar nature of their personalities, like with Marble. However, there weren't any episodes of the two except for Philly Vanilli, and that wasn't even a romance episode to begin with. But aside from that, I like Fluttershy's connection with Discord more anyway. Discord harmony is what already convinced me, but that's open for another review. So capping it off with Sugar Belle, both she and Mac have a few things in common, but enough differences to complement each other. The common traits are based on the simplicity in their livelihoods. Big Mac grew up as a farmer, and Sugar Belle grew up in a small town. Again, that town doesn't have a name, does it? The both of them are also experienced in baking pies and are utilized with their jobs. On the contrary, Sugar Belle is a baker as a profession compared to Big Mac, where he makes deliveries of pies more often. But above all else, she's much more vocal and communicative with him, which is what pushes him to be more active in what he has to say. This was proven in Hard to Say Anything, where he needed to step out of his comfort zone and being upfront with the Crusaders. Even continuing that point, Big Mac is a lot more vocal in dialogue than ever before in this episode. There are times when he's muttering to himself or he talks off screen. But when his emotions are kicking in, he really speaks up. This is a part of what challenges him compared to being silent all the time. Now this comes to a bit of a problem. The first of which is with Discord and then again with Big Mac as he snaps at Sweetie Belle. These two scenes both do favors of the narrative, but it also gets a little too hard to watch. On the contrary, this is where I dive in the two subplots back to back and then provide its pros and cons. Starting off is with Discord and Spike debating on the values of Hearts and Who's Day, and whether or not a holiday celebrating romance is ever appropriate. The way these two play off are absolutely hysterical, and it's an additional case where male characters are put to better use. The silly debate works really well with these two, as one is the optimist and the other is the cynicist. They almost come off as the conscience roles for Big Mac. I already mentioned a while back how Spike was made into a punching bag during Season 4, and that it was said by the staff there was no room for him. Well, this is what I meant when I said there is room for him. His interactions with Discord and Big Mac. This is especially given its callback to Dungeons and Discords in Season 6. On the contrary, Discord has a bitter take on the holiday, but with an understandable reason. This has been somewhat talked about in reality, as admittedly it's an odd type of holiday. Personal confession here, I'm not too big on Valentine's Day either, as romance can be celebrated at any time. Mind you, I don't hate the holiday, but Discord was not wrong when he mentions that Hearts and Who's Day, or Valentine's Day, is very commercialized, albeit he's a lot harsher and even makes his catch with Spike brutal as hell. Unfortunately, however, that brutality is what comes to a problem in the later half of the episode. While hiding from the CMC, Discord persuades Big Mac to strike first at Sugar Belle and ending the relationship before she allegedly does. Doing so triggers why Big Mac doesn't like talking more often, though it's a contradicting and shallow reason based on the episode he references. This is all at the expense of Discord's selfish actions simply because he wanted to play O&O. Ogres and Oubliettes. It's the show's version of Dungeons & Dragons. Regardless, this is what gets Big Mac at snapping at Sweetie Belle. An adult snapping at a child. Granted, he does apologize and admits that his feelings were getting to him, but I find it very uncomfortable at principle to get very aggressive to a kid, especially when they don't know the scenario someone else is going through. Additionally, having the CMC ask about their issues over his wasn't any better either, as they were oblivious to how Big Mac was feeling. Now, some could argue that kids make this mistake, but these kids in particular were dedicated to helping him back in Season 7. Preferably, if there was anything I would change in the scene, it would make sense for Big Mac to snap at Discord as a form of a mild comeuppance or a sense of karma, since he's partially responsible for encouraging Big Mac in the first place, and it would drive Discord to think outside the box and not dwell on a cynical nature of the holiday and his impatience in wanting to play O&O. To their credit, Discord still proactively contributes to Big Mac's confrontation, as he reveals at the end he was the one behind the broken wagon that Sugar was using. And Sweetie Belle does shrug off Big Mac's snapping and understands afterwards that something was bothering him. Not sure how a child would understand what Sweetie Belle says here, but I really shouldn't be complaining.
I'm sorry, Sweetie Belle. I'm just mad and I'm taking it out on you.
That's okay. I bet it felt good to get it out, though.
Actually, it did. Telling you how I felt just then. I gotta go.
So the other subplot involves the Cutie Mark Crusaders getting into a mix-up with Big Mac's pie for Sugar Belle. This was from the very beginning of the episode, as it was set up to give an invitation to Sugar for a surprise date night. However, despite that the CMC were helping set up the barn, the package arrives and they all assume that it's from a secret admirer for Sweetie Belle. Over the course of the episode, they scatter throughout Ponyville to find out who it's from. On a small tangent here, I love that Sweetie asks Snips and Snails with the desperate hope that they aren't the secret admirers. Cathartically, I was on her side. Now, obviously this was playing up a joke that both Sweetie and Sugar Belle's names are identical to each other, and it's also worth mentioning that they were both wondering whenever they would get their turn on receiving something in Hearts and Who's Day. But the way this was set up was rather sloppy. As soon as they see the package, they assume it was for Sweetie, despite that they were setting up the barn for Sugar Belle in the first place. This flustered me because I found it to be a poor assumption for plot convenience. The idea isn't bad because it does play up the role about jumping to conclusions. It's another part of the occurrence and having a miscommunication narrative. However, if I were to suggest anything, have them acknowledge first that Big Mac had his plan of delivering a pie for Sugar Belle, but argue that it's suspicious that it would be delivered to the barn instead of her, especially with the smudge having an unclear message. On a whole, I don't dislike the subplot, but I feel it could have been a little more polished. On the contrary, the biggest thing I love the most is Big Mac's development. As everything I mentioned here is all brought forth, Big Mac is stepping outside of his shell and is facing any possible outcomes, from hearing and processing what Sugar Belle said earlier, listening to any advice that either Discord or Spike provide, and confronting Sugar Belle over the worst and best possible way. This was a monumental step for him. This is in part by being vocal and upfront while his feelings were getting to him. Through all the trial and error and going through all the fears and confronting the issue, he finally confronts Sugar Belle with the utmost civility, saying that he respects Sugar's decisions and that everything he felt before would remind him of the good times he had with her, and also admitting to overhearing the conversation with Mrs. Cake. All those obstacles that Big Mac had faced had finally led him to realize this was all a misunderstanding. A simple conversation can fix and clear everything, but the fears are what hold you back. It is important to step out of your comfort zone, even if what you're going to face is unpleasant. This was something for Big Mac to learn, even for a second time, the other of which being open to Apple Bloom at the end of Sister of Social. Thus, the episode ends with the two back together and literally strolling down into the sunset for their date as planned. Now, small tangent here, since I brought up Marble Pie, I should go over the elephant in the room since I didn't talk about it in the Best Gift Ever. In that special, when both Big Mac and Sugar Belle were nuzzling each other, Marble appeared in the background as heartbroken at what she saw. This shot was such a huge deal when it happened that there was some fan content about the issue, including a song by Prince Whatever. People wanted to know what I thought about it when I was reviewing the special and preparing its upload. However, I didn't take it into account until afterwards. So with my opportunity here, I'll say here and now that while I'm not a big fan of either the character or the shipping with Big Mac, that shot DHX greenlit is beyond unacceptable. I may have forgiven this if there had been a future episode tackling the issue about Heartache, but there wasn't. This was made as a one-off gag, and it's just so spiteful and mean-spirited. If you want to disregard a possible relationship or tackle a legitimate heartbreak, then make an episode about it. Kinda like this one. Don't leave something like this hanging. That's horrible. Now, this doesn't change my feelings on the Best Gift Ever in itself, especially since I love it more than ever. But this is not how you write the end of a relationship. So, with that out of the way, the Break-Up Breakdown is not for everyone. And admittedly, it's not one of my favorite episodes either, but I really do appreciate what it offers, showing how you write a better miscommunication narrative by taking on any possible option that would hinder the structure in its entirety. And while episodes like Party of One have tackled before on how communication is key, this episode does its job clear enough to develop Big Mac on a massive scale, from assuming the worst to taking evasive actions and confronting and eavesdropping. It's a very solid episode. While I wasn't too fond of the CMC, the humor was top-notch with everything else. The commentary about the commercialism, while in your face at times from Discord and Spike, was handled hysterically. And even though Discord had his harsh nature, it's at least appreciative on where he places himself at the end of the episode, as he and Spike go on a high note to play another round of Ogres and Oubliettes. And of course, above all else, I love Big Mac's development and what he has to do for Sugar. So even if the episode had its issues, it's still a recommendation from me. So until next time, this is GoldenFox, and take care.